There you go. Thanks, Ives. Much appreciated. Okay, everybody feeling okay at this point? We've got 2 more lectures in this unit. We'll do the unit 2, and at the end of that, your first 2 major assignments. One of them is going to be a movie review. You're going to be watching Birth of a Nation and analyzing it for a historical document in its time period, and you're going to have your first exam, which is going to cover both of the units. Okay, and every class, after class, from noon until 1:30. That post-lecture quiz is going to be there, and that counts into your participation. So make sure you get those done as well. All right, so social questions. Today, we're going to look at a few different things in the 19th century. One of them is the way that the workforce structured American society, what happened there, what choices were made for who was going to be a part of it and who wasn't, or which part of it they were going to be. The second, and this is really the most important question in this period, is what do we do with the freed people? What do we do with this large, formerly enslaved population that can labor? How do we deal with those changes? And so we'll look at what happened in the 19th century, which set a pattern for the 20th century and put it in place. And then we're going to look at 2 other social groups that we pay attention to. One of them is indigenous people. What happened to Native people in the 19th century, right? We're suddenly talking about how land-grant universities got their land from land that was formerly indigenous lands, right? This is where did they go in the 19th century? What happened? We'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, women who had put a movement together for the vote in the 19th century and essentially gave over to abolition and would be put out of political, any kind of contention for being part of public life until the 20th century. So we are, just remember as well, in lecture, that didn't go. Let's try this. Lecture, there we go. So here's our map. We're in the 3rd, we're in the social. We're running roughly 1857 to 1896, although we're going to talk about the 50s, and I'm actually going to talk about the early 19th century, just to get a sense of the change in the labor force in these years. And let's just remember that we're framing the social lectures by looking at questions about the relationship between the economy, economic activity, and social structures. And that tends to be the most pressing kind of relationships that you see. So how does the structure of work in the businesses that are emerging structure and shape a society's identity, for example? We're also in these lectures, these social lectures, looking at the way life and the way the quality of life differed for different groups of people, because it did, right? So what kind of life could freedmen expect in the South? What kind of life could Native people expect in the United States, in the far West, their homeland? What kind of life could unmarried women expect, right? We'll be asking all of those. In these lectures, and all of these kind of carry us through the whole semester, we'll be asking why race and racism is a special category in the United States. And anybody who comes from overseas will tell you it's different in the United States. It's a special way. We deal with it in a unique way. It's uniquely ours. Why? Why does it hang? Why does it nag? And we'll be asking that question through all 6 of the social lectures. Slavery ended at the beginning of this course, but the trauma, right? And the despising ideas that still lurk out in our culture that some people hold about other people seem to have a staying power, and they seem to continue to shape things. Why? Why is that happening? All the way to the 21st century. And then finally, we'll ask through all of this, and I want you guys to reflect on this question: is there a hierarchy of social justice or injustices, right? Is the ethnic cleansing of Native people worse than the enslaving of African people, worse than the disenfranchisement of women? How do we weigh these differences, these alienations, these outsiding, and what do we do to account for bringing them in? Because as I talked about in the introductory lecture, part of social modernization is diversity. It's about bringing more people in. It's about bringing more genders in. It's about opening the door to opportunity to everyone. How do we make that happen? And is there some accountability that still lurks out there? Each of the injustices against each of the groups carry the same responsibility and require the same kind of consequences, in a sense. Okay, so let's get started. Unpacking slavery, repacking white racism amidst the social changes of the productive revolution. That is what we'll be talking about today. I'm going to argue that the change in economic activity, which I described last time, threatened the value of slavery and chattel labor, and offered wages for low-skilled, repetitive work. Industrialization didn't replace muscles. Like we think about industrialization, putting technology where muscles used to be. It didn't. It just made the brain power behind that muscle need to be less skilled. So you were working at a machine, in a sense. And so with this growing industrial revolution, there was a huge demand for more labor. But instead of filling that labor force with the work and workers, this large population of semi-skilled laborers in the South, who were just recently freed from bondage, the United States instead locked those people into a debt peonage and immigrated and encouraged immigration from Northern and Southern Europe to fill those jobs and to fill that need. Okay, that's the big argument of this period of time, but let's look at some of the major points and major changes. So first, let's talk about this region, and let's talk about in 1857. So this is the heart of the United States by 1860. This is where most of the investment, this is where most of the growth, this is where all of the materials are going. Cities are booming, railroads are growing. In 1857, at the end of this really productive decade, there was a sudden depression, a panic, an economic crisis. It had to do with gold. It had to do with gold supply in Europe. And Europe went into crisis, and then the Midwest went into crisis. And this was the first time that the United States' maturing industrial economy felt its interconnections with the globe. So a depression in Europe made a depression in the United States. And it raised questions for people who didn't like this system so much, particularly in the South, about how strong this system actually was. This was its first really full decade, and suddenly it was in collapse, it seemed like in 1857. Gave Southerners a particular confidence by the late 1850s about their own system, and just keep that in your mind. But because of all of these economic connections, there was a 2-year, what was called panic. It was a depression, like the Great Depression of the 1930s, like some of what we experienced after 2009. And it was a panic because this was connected across the Atlantic to the markets and to the global markets itself. So we as the United States experienced our first global crisis, economic crisis, connected with the rest of the globe. And it impacted this region the most. And this industrialized region felt like the world had ended, in a sense. In the middle of this, as it's all getting started, the South began a campaign to try to undo the laws. I'm going to see if I turn this off just a little. To undo the laws, particularly the Missouri Compromise, which said every time a free state comes into the territory, a slave state, every time a slave state, a free state, and no slave states north of this line. They wanted to get rid of that. They wanted to extend slavery, and they felt confident about it. And now where was I? So from the slave states' perspective, they looked at this, they saw this line, and they saw all of this as potential free territory. And so they thought we're about to be overwhelmed in this nation, right? So this is part of what's going on in the South's mind at this point, while they're also feeling strong. Helping the South was a very important Supreme Court case in 1857. You've probably heard of it, called the Dred Scott case. The case itself was brought by Dred Scott, who was a slave who had gone with his master into the territories and then bought himself freedom. Someone came back after him and pulled him back into South Carolina and said, you're going to be a slave. I bought myself freedom. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where they decided Dred Scott didn't have any standing in the court because he was not a citizen. In fact, all Blacks in the United States, Dred Scott said, are not citizens, whether they're free or whether they're enslaved. Citizenship does not extend to them. Just as important, it said, Congress cannot make laws about the territories and about slavery in the territories as well, that this was unconstitutional. And then, same year, for the first time since 1848, the United States military is engaged in warfare with its own people in the West, and these were the Mormon Wars. The Mormons, as you know, a sect of Christianity that claims Indians were the lost tribe of Israel. Golden tablets were found in Vermont, and they were chased out of everywhere in the East until they ended up in Utah. And they were moving towards trying to create their own country. They were trying to do the same thing Texas did. The United States wanted no more of this republic building or nation building. And so they went to war with Utah, and there was an armed conflict, several different battles. They claimed it was over. They're I'm now forgetting the name of the word, they're having multiple wives, that was against the law. But essentially it was their concern that they're going to have another Texas on their hands, that they're going to have another country saying, look, we're now the Republic of Utah. So they sent in troops to fight against polygamy. And by the end of 1857, Utah was clearly back in the United States, but this put a significant number of troops into this interior region where they would stay through the rest of the 19th century. So, military in the far West, growing conflicts in the territories, because now it's open game for whether you're going to get a state to become slave or free, which is a growing conflict in the Kansas territory at this point. An economic depression in the core region that is going to last until the Civil War begins. And all of this is centered on this vast industrial coal-powered region of feed, staple crop, fuels, and raw materials, right? The steel belt, what will become the steel belt of the United States. Let's think about the society a little bit. Let's think about what a difference 1860 meant from what the United States had been, and we're thinking about labor force at this point. Okay, so we'll go back in time, and this is taking us back to 1800. We'll notice that for the first 50 years, agricultural labor is the dominant labor in the United States. We're an agricultural nation, right? So this is farm labor versus what would be industrialized labor, non-farm labor itself, right? Let's see, again, where was I? Okay. After 1850, though, we can see what happens, right? There's this sudden growth of non-agricultural, right? That's your industrial labor force growing. That's the rise of manufacturing and industrialization as an economic, that's the social outcome of the rise of industrialization. And then during the last 30 years of the 19th century, we see it just accelerated, it exploded. Right, so it went from even in 1870 to more than twice as many workers in industrial work at this point, right? So we shift, so when you think about the United States shifting from being an agricultural nation to an industrial nation, this is where it happens most, this is where it happens on the ground. It's what people are doing with their time, what kind of work they're engaged in. And it's half and half in 1870. Most people are in cities, working in factories, working in some form of manufacture by 1900. Let's look at this composition. This is the overall composition of the workforce, and you can see agriculture going in 1870 from 50% to 30% in 1910. That pushes us a little farther forward. Most of that is in manufacturing and constructing, but mining is doubling, other ones as well, and agricultural labor we can see in this chart, right? So again, agricultural is at the top. The colors are 1910 and 1870. And so you can see for all of them, agricultural labor didn't even double in this period of time. Its growth was slowing and slowing and slowing. And we'll see by 1920, it doesn't grow anymore at all because there's no more jobs in the agricultural sector. Everything that's happening is happening in the industrial. And we can see in this period, it quadruples in mining, it quadruples in commerce, triples or quadruples in manufacturing and construction. All of these jobs are growing and exploding, and this workforce is ballooning. And agricultural labor goes slower and slower. Let's see. And again, we can see by sector. And what we really want to note is agriculture, which is blue. This is 1900. Oops, let's go back to that. 1900, it is about a third. So by 1900, we're an urban industrial society. That's what we're doing. We're all involved in industry, and just a small part of us are out there on the farms. So fewer than a quarter in agriculture. And this really signals the arrival by 1900 of an urban workforce and an urban population. More people in the economy doing a greater variety of things that are not farming, okay? Let's look a little bit closer at this population, this industrialized workforce. So everything but the blue, you guys recognize him, I hope, Karl Marx. So this industrial change to society was Karl Marx's biggest concern. What the heck's going on here, he said. He recognized in England and in Europe during this period of time, there had been this massive transformation of his society at the hands of fossil fuel powered capitalism, what we call industrialism. And its social outcomes have been studied since this time. He was the guy, he spent 10 years in the British Library reading economic treatises, trying to make sense of what had happened. Marx looked out in the 1850s and 1860s at England, at Germany, but he was also well aware of what was happening in the United States. And so Das Kapital, his study of capital, includes making sense of these 1850s in the United States as well. And in all these places, he saw resource production, including industrialized mining, railroads, mass fabrication of steel, and then all the subsidiary metals and alloys that go with steel, and the mass production of textiles and household goods. When Marx looked at this, he said, okay, we've got two major classes out there. This is what's happening. We've got the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the owners of these factories and technologies. And we have the non-owners, the proletariat, the laboring class. That's what's happening. So these guys, these capitalists have figured out how to coerce people into selling their labor cheap and then taking the profits for themselves. That's kind of Marx's understanding of how capitalism worked. And he said, because that proletariat is in fact creating this surplus value, that's a contradiction if the capitalists walk away with it. And that contradiction is going to become so great that at some point, workers are going to realize that they're being taken for a ride in this system, and they're going to rise up, create socialism, get the state to start to work in their favor, and that will eventually disappear to communism and a worker paradise where workers are running their own factories and gaining their own value from the system, okay? That's Marx's theory in a nutshell. He said we saw same kind of transition from feudalism to capitalism, and I predict we can kind of push this into action. A lot of revolutions in the 19th and early 20th century were premised on the idea that you could rationally make this happen, that you could push this thing forward. He said this is, sorry, where am I now? Dun, dun, dun. So the gradual gain control. Let's take a look though at, well, first of all, nobody disputes the insights that Marx brings, okay? He's one of the greatest thinkers of our age too. What he understood, what he made sense of, gave us categories to think with and work with, and helped us to begin to think about this radical new structure of capitalism. And he's probably had more impact on the 20th century than maybe any 19th century thinker but Darwin. But Alfred Chandler's visible hand, which I talked about last time, and this emergence of these management hierarchies, this new business structure actually necessarily created a slightly different social structure than Marx had anticipated, right? We've got this whole huge group in the middle, this middle class, in between the robber barons and the laboring working class. These growing managerial hierarchies are hiring more and more managers, more and more administrative support. And so this is a new and very different laboring class. These are people who don't own the means of production, but they don't work with their hands either, right? It's intellectual labor, it's management. The most they do is type or work with a pencil. They're using their minds, mental work, mental labor being sold, while their bodies are mostly at rest. Why do we have obesity in the 20th century? Most people don't move while they work. That's the main reason. But where do these guys fit in Marx's analysis, right? People who've thought about it, who are Marxists, say, well, it's just a false consciousness that they're carrying. They're patsies to the capitalists. They're doing the capitalist bidding, as it were. And we could, well, maybe that's the case. Maybe it's not, right? Here, let's put people into these spaces a little bit and think about 19th century United States and who these people were. By the 1870s, this economy is even with the agricultural economy, and by 1900, it's far surpassed it. So this structure increasingly becomes the dominant structure of American society itself in this age. So our vast Rockefellers own these huge enterprises, but the management hierarchy begins to open up intellectual work to a growing working class of middle class men or middle class of men, and gradually even begins to open opportunities for women in secretarial and other kind of administrative support roles in these factories, right? It also created this vast, huge opportunity for low or no skilled labor, employment opportunities for people who are looking for employment, who didn't otherwise have employment. And in fact, one of the distinctions of this is that this would often be filled with immigrants. It could have been filled with freedmen, filled with people who are moving into the economy. By the second generation, and probably some of you have parents or grandparents or great-grandparents who are immigrants. By the second or third generation, it's no longer laboring, but most of the children and grandchildren have moved into the middle class. There's a generational flow, a generational movement of opportunity. And as these industries create more and more wealth and take up more and more space, they're also creating more and more opportunity in that space, and opportunity for upward mobility. Bill Gates, he came from this class and moved up to that class. Zuckerberg, he came from this class and moved up to that class, right? And you trace their parents back, you can trace back to immigration as well. So generational opportunity and generational upward mobility, which isn't what Marx predicted. Because if your children become middle class, where's your consciousness going to come from? Where are you going to recognize yourself as exploited if the system is actually giving your family an opportunity itself, right? So upward mobility across generations and no permanent underclass, at least in theory. It ought to be able to work that way. We'll find that it did create a permanent underclass, but and I guess maybe we could think a little bit about when that starts to happen. It's probably already happened at this point, but here's a picture of meat packers in the 1890s. This is your typical working class. What do you notice about this group? 1890s US. They all look poor, you know, struggling, probably Italians, Lithuanians. They look like Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans to me. Any women? Oh man. How about the skin? They were probably not looked upon as white by white Americans, but they're not African Americans. These are not freedmen working in these jobs. These are immigrants from Europe who are filling these jobs, large numbers of immigrants. So 100% male. Women rarely move into the working class until the late 20th century. 100% white, and we put quotes around white because white is not a thing, it's a culture, and it's an identity, and it's hard to pin down onto anything but not African, not former freedmen in these plants. And so opportunities created by industry, we want to notice by 1890, didn't mean opportunity for everybody who was available to work in the workforce in the United States. Okay. If we look back at the changing labor force again in the first half. We divide it down further and we divide out the slave labor. So blue is your slave labor force. The agricultural laborers working in the South, right? Those are African people enslaved. By 1850, we can see the gray is industrial labor, free industrial labor, because all industrial labor was free. And the orange is free agricultural labor. Those are still your farmer settlers. But we just want to compare the blue to the gray, because the blue was the potential for that gray growth. And we see gray grew, and so did enslaved by 1850, even though industrialized labor had passed it for the very first time. And by 1860, even though the slave population grew by 700,000, the industrial labor force grew even faster by 5 million. I'm showing you all of this because it's showing the potential employment opportunities in this sector that's growing right at the dawn of its explosion. At the same time, we know that blue line is going to disappear and become free labor. Where is it going to go? What are we going to do with it? Right? If we look at it in terms of, so we'll go 1850, we'll just look at this decade in terms of free labor and slave labor. We notice the same phenomenon. Northern free agriculture and industrial workforce is larger than the southern enslaved workforce, and it grows during the 1860s, right? Free labor grows by half, almost 2.5 million more laborers. Where are they coming from? They're immigrating. This is immigration. And the shift in the labor force, and we see the growth in the non-slave economy. European immigrants are the foundation of this workforce. And so in this context, let's remember 1857. Again, a depression stalls the core region, and it gives the South some confidence. Dred Scott opens up territories to population-driven slavery, giving slavery a fighting chance, which actually the slave owners take by fighting in Kansas, quite literally. And then Abraham Lincoln runs on a belief in the opportunity economy of the North. That's what Lincoln ran on. His opposition to slavery was because he believed in what he called free labor, because he believed the industrial system offered a better opportunity to everybody, including enslaved people at that point in time. Slave owners were scared by the power of industrial capitalism. The numbers, just the sheer numbers, it was going to overwhelm them, right? In a representative democracy, sheer numbers are what matter. And they're losing the numbers game. They're losing the culture society game as well. And this contributed to their distrust of Lincoln and his values. They knew, because people were talking about in the 1850s, that if industrialism started really catching fire, slavery would be no longer necessary. It would be too expensive. Industrialism was lowering that cost of labor. So the symbol of Lincoln was the symbol of industrialization and of this new structural change taking place. And Lincoln had supported an end to slavery in the territories. He was against the Dred Scott. But he never said when he was running, he was going to run against slavery himself, that he was going to undermine it himself, even though he had his own personal views. But the South seceded nevertheless in 1860. So what was the basis on which the Southern states claimed the right to secede? What would give them the right to secede? They were part of the Constitution. They signed up to be Constitution. Do we have any other documents that are about breaking from governments? Say again? Well, even before that, the Articles of Confederation brought us kind of halfway together, and it wasn't strong enough, and then we did the Constitution. I'm thinking of the Declaration of Independence, when a group of people say we're no longer represented by a government. So they tried to use the Declaration, the logic of the Declaration of Independence, to secede, right? To say states have the rights if they're not being represented, and we don't like what Lincoln's doing. They were also pretty confident in their system. And they were afraid that if they didn't get it contained, this emerging northern system, the state would just overwhelm them. And because of the Depression, they felt like they were getting the North at a point of weakness. They thought they probably had an advantage. And so as they essentially just started this secession and went to take a military base off of Virginia. And as soon as Lincoln decided he wasn't going to let this stand, as soon as he decided this was going to be a military conflict, the war was over. There was no way the South was going to win this war. They miscalculated everything going into it. They were not prepared for industrialized warfare, and this was the first industrialized war, and the region that was industrialized was in the Union, and their infrastructure was wildly inferior as well, right? So we can just look at the railroads. Remember looking at these railroads before. Look at the North versus the South, right? These are markets. This is productive ability. This is population. This is amount of industrialization. We can see how much more industrialized the North is from the South at the dawn. It was a foregone conclusion. The North had more people, they had more production, and this was going to be that kind of a war. Nonetheless, the South went ahead and tested it. And so starting with South Carolina and following quickly by 10 other southern states, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Virginia, legislatures in the states passed what were called Articles of Secession, claiming independence from the United States of America and claiming participants now in this new Confederate States of America. These are the pink states you see on the map there. And the yellow are the Union states up here. And then you see 4 orange states, which are called border states. Anyone know what the border states were as we went into this conflict? Any guesses?
Was Virginia one of the border states?
The border states were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware.
Oh.
Thanks, Nathaniel. They were the states that stayed in the Union, but had slavery. So the Civil War was about slavery in all but 4 slave states. 4 of the slave states stayed with the Union, okay? And continued to be slave states throughout the Civil War. All right, so those who love war stuff can study this slide more carefully in your spare time at home, but in general, it shows how the Union won this war. It shows that while the South won a few early battles up in the mid-Atlantic, the North divided the South by first capturing the Mississippi, so cutting off Texas altogether, and then it had divided it again with Sherman's march to the sea. Union victories start to increase in 1864 and culminate with a declaration of the war's end in April of 1865. There was unprecedented death in this war. This was still the bloodiest war in American history because it was a bunch of guys marching like they were fighting with 18th century muskets, and they were fighting with industrialized machine guns and some of the most powerful weaponry we'd ever put out on a battlefield. So it was carnage, it was slaughter out there, firing at each other with these weapons. The first industrialized war, the US Civil War. And it was the North saying to the South, nope, you're not going anywhere. You signed up for the Constitution and you're staying with it. I want to turn back to the question of laborers in all of this. It's kind of interesting story in the midst of this. So this is the Emancipation Proclamation, right? What's the Emancipation Proclamation do? Free slaves, right? That's what we remember. The Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves. In fact, it isn't about freeing slaves. It's actually a tactical effort to use the labor in the South against the South, right? What Lincoln declared in this document was that all of the slaves in the Confederacy, not the 4 slave states in the Union, all the slave states in the Confederacy, a nation that claimed it wasn't the United States anymore, over which Lincoln had no actual authority unless the war was won. All of those slaves were free. More important, such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed services. That is, they would be welcomed by Union soldiers. They would be given a uniform and they would be allowed to fight against the South. It was an invitation for slaves to free themselves, right? The slaves in the border states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, remained in bondage. He didn't free the slaves in the Union, right? He was trying to get a tactical advantage. We actually can understand what happened here a little bit better by looking at the study done by W.E.B. Du Bois. This was done during the Great Depression. One of the great early 19th century Black intellectuals, first Black PhD in the United States. He studied what happened. And what he argues happened was well before Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation, he started about a year earlier getting letters from his generals in the field who would say, there are hundreds of men showing up here who have left the plantation and they want to fight. What do we do? A year of slaves freeing themselves, putting themselves in the hands of Union soldiers and saying, give us a gun, we'll fight. And Lincoln says, oh, well, we might have an advantage here. So what Du Bois argues is that slaves actually freed themselves. And the state realized it was a tactical advantage. Lincoln realized it was a tactical advantage and said, let's use this, let's make it go. And he argues that it was the same force, freedmen, who led the Reconstruction, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Slavery didn't end during the Civil War. Slavery would not end until the 13th Amendment. It was passed in January 1865 and then be ratified later in the year. Lincoln had insisted by this point, so he wasn't anti-slavery when he came in, but as he's running with the Republicans in 1865, he insisted that this become the Republican platform. And so it's after the war, as the war's kind of coming to an end, that anti-slavery and Lincoln and the Republicans all coalesce into a message that's theirs themselves. And so he insisted that the 13th Amendment be central to the Republican platform. Passed in January 5th, 1865. Lincoln was assassinated in April of that year, April 15th. So Abraham Lincoln never saw a United States where slavery was outlawed. He never lived in the United States where there was no slavery. But the end of all of this, the end of the war, the defeat of the South created this larger problem for the United States. And that was, what do we do with these states and these people? This was treason, right? These were states that left us altogether. And even more importantly, we've passed an amendment that just freed 3.6 million people, almost 4 million people, who before that were in bondage. They were property. They haven't been provided schools. They haven't been provided education. They've been used as a labor force only. What do we do? What's our obligation to all of this, right? The answer was the Reconstruction. This is what we call the Reconstruction. And it was a multiple set of answers. It was bumbling, it was clearly improvised, and it got more radical after Lincoln died and Andrew Johnson, who was a Democrat and a Southern Democrat, a Tennessee Democrat, took the presidency and started fighting against the Reconstruction itself. But the effort of the Reconstruction was to answer that question. How do we get these states back? How do we get citizenship out to these people? These former slaves are now free. They're called freedmen at this point. These people once represented the largest labor force in the United States until 1850, right? When industrialization outgrew it. Now they could act as independent people. Now they were free to be human beings. Nobody could hold them against their will. Very first thing slaves did, freedmen did, was they sought out their families, right? And we see this almost in the first year of freedom. It's like, where's my kids? Where's my mother? Where's my father? Where's my aunt? Where's my uncle? Where are they, right? They went looking for them. This was a priority, and they went to great lengths to track down separated children, separated parents, getting families back together, priority number one, because that was the biggest horror of slavery. It wasn't that you had to work, it was that these MFs took your kids. They took them and they sold them, and your family was divided and divided and divided in that way. So this free movement through the landscape afforded this rediscovery, reconnection of families, and it was protected by the presence of Union troops. Freedmen felt safe, at least initially, moving around. Curiously, they often found themselves gathered at old plantations that ended up being gathering points because they were points that were familiar, points where all the family might have been together in one place or another. So this really positive outcome for former slaves had an inverse outcome on the question of states' entries, however, because I told you Lincoln's assassination put the Tennessee Democrat Andrew Johnson into the presidency, and Johnson's White House, as soon as he took power, opposed everything that the Republicans in Congress were doing. He began offering pardons to former Confederate generals, former Confederate troops in the South, and in fact, the White House became kind of like a revolving door of Southern Confederates who had funds and wanted Johnson's political favor and thought they could advance Johnson's political ambitions, and he gave it away. He also, on behalf of them, vetoed every piece of Republican legislation that came through Congress. His actions took a Congress that was fairly moderate and radicalized it, right? It made it angry, and it put Congress in the hands of the really radical abolitionist Republicans, who, instead of taking what was going to be a slow move, began to argue for the full rights of citizenship right away, began pressing for free people to become constitutionally and institutionally whole in the United States. And they did this in a number of ways. Most importantly, they set up the Freedmen's Bureau. And so this was an effort paid for by the federal government to help freedmen into society itself. Southerners had tried to deny freedmen the vote, and tried to deny them some movement through an institution called the Black Codes, which were essentially slave codes rewritten. These freedmen bureaus were efforts to kind of get around that local politics, multi-purpose centers that advanced the cause of citizenship and participation. They provided legal advice, they provided legal training, they provided education. You needed to learn how to read. They provided strategies for freedmen to find their family, to find resettlement. They provided schools for children. This was all let's get the freedmen into society itself. They also wrote and passed the 14th Amendment, probably one of the most important amendments of the 19th century. This created, among other things, a national citizenship. No longer up to the states to decide whether you're a citizen. If you're born in the United States, you are a citizen and you get equal protection under the law. Congress passed this in the summer of 1866. It wasn't ratified until 1868, but when it becomes ratified, the federal government becomes the arbiter of citizenship, at least on paper, at least legally. And all of the laws of the United States apply to all citizens, well, all men equally. Women still don't quite have full citizenship at this point. This effort transformed the politics of the South. It transformed them. With the strong backing of Union forces and the strong backing of a Congress that supported this effort, the South became the first biracial democracy in the history of the world. And we see biracial representation in all of the Southern states. In fact, we see proportional representation. So states that have a majority Black population, like South Carolina or Louisiana, have a majority Black legislature. Nothing like it had ever happened before in the world. And they voted in these states on these new constitutions, voted on by biracial constituents. And as I said, many of them contained Black majorities. All of them didn't. And this was really throughout the late 1860s. The 14th Amendment allowed freedmen to become real, active participants in political life, right? So there's a couple of years there where it appeared that this biracial democracy was going to be the day, but it was not to be. All of these efforts were met with increasing and growing violence. Mobs of men, mostly, almost entirely, attacking freedmen's schools, attacking voting centers, right? Attacking freedmen themselves. These are often men who once owned or managed these freed people as their own property. They took offense. They were offended by now having these people as their leaders. And they were offended that the federal government, which they didn't see as their friend, was forcing this on them, was pressing this down on them. And so this is driven by fear, a sense of political loss, a sense of a loss of power, but it acted out with these really terroristic, violent acts. They wouldn't not only attacked freedmen's schools, they lurked at the polls all of the time. And this was not uncommon in the South, where when freedmen showed up at the polls, they'd be told who they're going to vote for. And so as the 1860s weave into the 1870s, this white backlash just is pressing back and is saying, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to intimidate. We're going to do whatever we can to make this happen. I'll talk about it next time, but partly in response to all of this violence, the Justice Department was created to try to protect, try to have a federal force to protect folks like this. In response to all of this intimidation, Congress passed the 15th Amendment, which was a voting amendment, guaranteeing the right to vote to all male citizens of the United States, making it a federal crime to deny the vote. That was written in 1869, passed in 1870, but the Southerners were just all out. They launched a campaign against Northerners that was extremely anti-Semitic and suggested that these carpetbaggers, these Northern Republicans, were just coming to rip off the South, threatening violence. They came from Ohio, some of these carpetbaggers. Equal hate and disdain for Southern Republicans as well, Southerners who would dare to help the Union in any way. They were called scalawags. And so politics of the Reconstruction South started from this sort of idyllic biracial democracy that was working and very quickly devolved into this violent resistance to anyone and anything that helped that political system. It became a solid self in a sense by the 1870s. The terrorist campaign launched by very well organized white militia groups, the White League and the KKK, who are shown here, and who believed, as their logo declared, this is a white man's government. These efforts grow through the 1870s and get more and more bold as the US military is focusing more and more attention on Indian wars and the far West. So there's this waning attention in the 1870s. These scare tactics are designed to suppress Black votes and designed to suppress Black voices. And by 1877, it succeeds. This whole movement succeeds in shutting down the Reconstruction. The episode was called the Compromise of 1877. It was a contested presidential election. Democrats said they won. Republicans said they won. Republicans said, okay, here's the deal. You give us the presidency and we'll pull the troops out of the South. And you can have a solid South. You can have it back. And so the Republicans won the presidency in 1877 in exchange for turning the South back over to these white forces and to these local forces. And the Republicans once and for all abandoned the freemen altogether. And so what of these free people, these laborers who are sort of struggling to become a part of society, where there's opportunity growing in the North that could be very lucrative for them? Without the support of the national government and with a local and firm and unyielding racial hierarchy, the blacks are on the bottom of this, which had been now imposed by the Southern racial order. Legislatures quickly became all white again. And in the 1870s, you don't see another Black legislature till the end of the 20th century in the South. So they become all white again. The freed people who'd found their families were gradually being forced back onto the land that they had escaped from to tend cotton on land that they would be leased. This land will be leased to you. The seeds will be leased to you. The overseer you owe money to, so you got to keep working year after year after year. So this is just one plantation, 1860 to 1881. It's transformation. It shows the way in which most of the plantations in the South were transformed from these centralized plantation operations to these leasing, family lease, debt peonage operations, where freedmen every year owed more on the seeds and on the fertilizers and on the transportation than they can ever recover from the price they get for the cotton that they grow, right? Southerners like to claim, some white Southerners like to claim that sharecropping as the system was known, and this is what they said, well, this is just a natural evolution of the system. It's a free market version of slavery, in a sense. Freedmen chose these conditions. But we know that through the violence in the culture, they were forced into these conditions. And when we look at the optics, so this is a freed plantation. There's a group of freedmen, right? All of the optics certainly look like slavery still. There's a white man with a gun and several dogs overseeing a group of laborers in the field. Large group, a family, men, women, and children, right? So was it the free market version of something, or was it a return to something that had somehow sneakily become legal? It certainly consumed the whole South, almost every county. Sharecropping becomes the economy of the South, at least for the time being. We're going to see a shift start in the early 20th century. And so all of that labor, about 1.5 million laborers available to go and work and unskilled in the North, instead become trapped in place, unable to create enough wealth to even get themselves off the land itself, as the owner of that land profits from the cotton that's being sold, right? Incredibly wasteful system, incredibly wasteful. People's labor was literally being stolen, literally stolen. It's just a step above slavery economically. And where sharecropping didn't capture former freedmen or the labor of former freedmen, and especially among men, young men without families, the new black codes came to the rescue by the 1870s. Slowly but surely, black codes in the South criminalized large populations of young black men. So the 13th Amendment, if you've ever read it, outlaws slavery except if you've been arrested. If you've been arrested, you can be forced to work for free. The 13th Amendment had one little out, and the black codes opened the door to that. And so because the 13th Amendment said if you get arrested, you can become slaves, we see these work gangs begin to appear, young black men being arrested for whatever, looking the wrong way, crossing the street the wrong way, not being where they're supposed to be, anything someone could decide. And so suddenly they've clamped down on this population. They've restricted movement. They've eliminated voting for freedmen. They've legally incarcerated and re-enslaved young black men who are arrested arbitrarily. And they've put in place what we know as the Jim Crow system. All of public life will be segregated. There's the white South and there's the black South, and never the two shall meet. And as if to put sort of a national coda on this racial hierarchy, another Supreme Court case ends this system, and this is Plessy v. Ferguson. Homer Plessy was 1/8 black, 1/8 black. So he had one grandparent who was of African descent, but that meant he was black according to the Southern laws. He decided to challenge the segregation laws in the South in the 1890s. He did a Rosa Parks thing. He sat on the white train car instead of the black train car, and he got arrested. And his intention was to get the Supreme Court to say these segregated things are wrong. And instead, the Supreme Court said, yeah, you know what? They're just fine. We can have two Americas. We can have separate but equal facilities for everyone. And so Jim Crow, the segregationist idea became embodied in a constitutional decision that said, this is the law of the land. We can do this. Separate facilities everywhere, and there's nothing wrong with that in our Constitution. Just want to look at one little last chart about the labor force. So that blue line is Northern and Western Europe. This is Southern Europe. Two big waves we can see move in of European immigration, a major one in 1880, and that kind of declined, and then Southern Europe in the early 1890s, right? Hundreds of thousands of laborers who come overseas to fill jobs that could have been filled by the freedmen in the South. And not until the 1920s will demand push itself into that population, 19 teens, and start to pull Black laborers to the North. But initially, a missed opportunity, right? And instead, Southern Blacks are left in debt peonage. A whole new group of European immigrants get that really crappy first experience of that laboring job in terrible conditions, but their kids do better and their grandkids do even better, right? They get to advance through the American dream. So that's the kind of core labor force. I want to talk about indigenous people for just a minute, and then quickly about women in the same period of time, and then we'll bring this to an end. So native spaces, oof, man, native spaces are complicated. They're really complicated. This is traditional tribal lands pre-contact, right? Native people were everywhere. That's the reservation system that we ended up with in the 20th century. Massive loss of land, one might say, in the process, right? What happened here? Now, I mentioned multiple times in the earlier lectures that all of those demographic maps we're looking at don't include Native people. They don't include Native people because we weren't counting Native people. We didn't consider them citizens. We didn't consider them part of our nation at all. In 1860, there were a little over 300,000 Native people left in the far west, a little under 300,000. Right? Very small population. That's 1% of the 30 million people who populate the United States at this point, 1%. So a tiny little minority, and most of them are still nomadic at this point. So they're in smaller groups and they're moving around the Great West. And as far as they're concerned in the 1850s, that's all hunky-dory because we signed a treaty in 1851 that said all of the mountains between the Great Plains and the Pacific coast belong to the Native people. This is kind of our last, okay, here's India. We kept kind of moving them further and further west. And this was the Fort Laramie Treaty. All the mountains, all the plateaus in the interior for the 5 far western tribes of the United States. This was done so that they wouldn't attack gold rush miners coming over the road. Like, we'll give you this as long as you let us move through your territory. Excuse me. Within 5 years, however, a very ambitious man named Isaac Stevens had settled himself in Seattle and was beginning to move eastward from Seattle, trying to open both a gold mining frontier and, more importantly, he wanted a railroad to Seattle, or even a road if he could get a road. And so he started moving into this interior mountain in the north and signing treaties with Native American people so that we could get that land. So he signed 3 in 1855, which opened up Western Washington, Northern Idaho, all of what is present-day Montana, and part of Eastern North Dakota, all got granted in these 3 treaties. 1855, though, Congress wasn't really thinking about the far west, and it wouldn't ratify his treaties. It just sat on them. So he sat out there for 3 years. He watched the Mormon War happen in 1857. And then in 1858, when we might remember, there's a whole lot more troops out in this region because of the Mormon War. There is a episode that happens along the Snake River, a little episode. Colonel Edward Steptoe decided to take troops up along the Snake River to check on the natives. The tribes of this region had formed a pact that said, we're not going to let any more gold miners in here. We don't want it. We don't want it. We don't want it. They hadn't signed the treaty that had been sitting in Congress, and they said, we're going to fight for our land because we know what happens when gold miners come. So Steptoe gets up the river a little bit. He gets cornered by some Native people and then chased out. Nobody was killed, but it was a humiliation. Steptoe came back to Fort Walla Walla with his tail between his legs, like, man, they're crazy out there. They're trying to kill us. They're trying to come after us. George Wright, who had finished fighting the Mormons in Utah, was at Fort Walla Walla as well. And he said, okay, we're not going to stand for this. He grabbed up a garrison of men and they marched into the region where they're encamped. They found the chiefs, they rounded them up, and he hung all 6 of them in front of their people. So this is what happens when you come after our guys. And then he went over to their next encampment where they had 800 horses, which was their main form of wealth, and he slaughtered all 800 of them to remove any wealth from these people as well. Within 6 months, Congress ratified all 3 treaties. That land opened up, and suddenly Idaho, Montana, and the gold rush eastward is moving into that region. 1860, 61, the gold rush is really starting to pick up in this region. And we've got people now moving into Montana from the east. So they're coming up through Utah, Salt Lake City, Idaho, and up from the south side up into Montana. And miners leaving for the season in 1862 start to get killed on the trail. And it turns out they're moving through Shoshone territory. So they're coming from Montana down through here to Salt Lake City. This region here, though, had not been treated. It was sovereign Shoshone land. Shoshone were not happy. They're one of those interior tribes. We own this. What are you people doing here? You're not allowed. And so they started killing. They killed 6 miners, at which point, what's his name? Connor brought troops from Salt Lake City and marched on a winter encampment. And on January 29th, 1863, opened fire with howitzers and these industrialized guns, same guns that'll be slaughtering the South in the Civil War, are being used to slaughter 400 Shoshone in this case, just massacred in their tents. And it was mostly women and children in this camp. This opens up movement into the gold rush again. The following year on the Colorado front, another general armed with these industrial weapons, trying to get access to gold, massacres Cheyenne people, 200 to 500, they're not sure exactly, mostly women and children as well, in a winter camp. Thousands of Native people killed in these years, and violence increasing in these years, in almost every case, to open up access to gold and gold rushes themselves. The famous one you know about, we actually lost. The US lost this, the Battle of Little Bighorn. That's exactly what General Custer was trying to do, was trying to get to the Black Hills. And he was defeated and humiliated in this sense. That did not stop us, however. Despite the defeat, we quickly colonized and went in and opened up the Black Hills. We also got a chip on our shoulder, the US military, about the Lakota Sioux. Lakota Sioux would pay for this eventually, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But just to see the scale of the warfare in the American West, every single one of those red X's is a battle with Native Americans, is a fight to try to depopulate, de-people this region. Most of them had to do with access to gold, and most of them were brutal. They were just brutal. They were about encircling camps and killing hundreds in order to weaken the will of the people and convince them to get onto reservations. So thousands of Native Americans killed while this war, the Civil War, is raging in the East as well. I want to talk about Wounded Knee. So there were, like I said, about 300,000, probably under 100,000 by the 1890s, who are still nomadic, who are still moving around, who remain determined to stay nomadic, and were willing to fight violently for that right, or that freedom if necessary, to protect their land. And it was the upper plains, really, that was the last kind of holdout. The Lakota Sioux, they were led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. That Sitting Bull you can see pictured there. They had been resisting efforts to round them up for years. And they were finally in 1890 cornered in Wounded Knee, North Dakota. wintertime, brutal cold out on the plains. It was below zero. And they realized they were cornered. And so they offered no resistance. We give up, wave the white flag. But then, as they were there, sitting, getting ready to move the reservation, they engaged in what you see there, which is called the ghost dance. And it's a really haunting dance. And they danced, and they're chanting, and they're dancing, and they're chanting. And this is a sacred ceremony for them that's designed to call up ancient ancestors to help you in a transition. And the US Army freaked out. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't understand it. And they opened fire, and they shot them. And they killed that day 300 Lakota, 200 women, children among them. And so there they are putting bodies in. I show this picture every time. So they actually photographed themselves picking up frozen dead bodies from the ground, right? This was for them a picture worth taking. These men, women, and children that were left there. Natives were effectively eliminated as any kind of force in the region by 1890. Was it genocide? What happened with the indigenous people? You'd say yes. Okay, and why would you say?
Well, they're a small population, and we see these numbers, 400 killed, 500 killed. And these people, they didn't even do anything wrong. They're just expressing their native beliefs. And then they just get killed in mass numbers.
They get killed in mass numbers. So the question of genocide is actually one that historians have asked about this. Was this genocide? And the answer is a tentative no, it wasn't genocide. It was very close. It was the next worst thing, which is what we call ethnic cleansing. And this was clearly an ethnic cleansing episode. It's an effort to remove people from lands that were once theirs in order to take over that land. We killed a lot of them in the process, but it wasn't an intentional effort to wipe them out, even though some people like Custer and others would have said that's what they wanted. Even Teddy Roosevelt said there's no Indian like a dead Indian. But it was horrible. This is the late 19th century. This is getting the gold that gets the Midwest up and running, is also about clearing these folks out. It's about ethnic cleansing, moving the people to a new place where they're powerless and where their culture is erased, right? And so in the course of 50 years, indigenous people in the West were moved to the wastest of the waste places of the West. They were rendered non-citizens. They were subjects, but non-citizens. And they were promised payments and provisions by the federal government to stay put, most of which never came in the volume that was needed. These are the spaces that were completely alienated from any of the wealth and opportunity that exists in the US economy, right? They were fully marginalized, fully pushed outside, and left there in that position. And so this is the end of the 19th century for indigenous people. We'll return to them in the next unit. And I want to talk really quickly just about women. Women didn't get a really good deal in the 19th century. We'll look at women a little more closely next time. But women do not have full citizenship in the United States. Unmarried women are the subjects of their fathers. Married women are the subjects of their husbands, right? They can't vote. They can't run for public office. They can't work in businesses. They are constrained into this domestic space. That is the fate for women in the 19th century. But as early as the 1820s, women were talking about political participation in the United States, and they began arguing for what's called women's suffrage. Women deserve the vote. They should have the vote. It was mostly elite women on the East Coast in particular who came from enough wealth to be able to kind of argue for their participation. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott were two of the early founders of women's suffrage. In 1848, so 12 years before the Civil War, there was a huge meeting in Seneca, New York, the Seneca Convention, where they put a platform together where the abolitionists and the women's suffragists said, this is a similar cause, let's fight together for this cause. So there were blacks and women saying, we got to eliminate slavery. We're going to extend the vote to former slaves and to women. We've got to improve democracy, essentially, they were arguing. So they put this on the table just as the United States finished up its war with Mexico. So just as the far West came into our imagination. Wyoming, just as a side note, always had women's suffrage. Wyoming came in as a state and a territory where right from the start, and that was 1870, women could vote. That was because they needed the numbers in order to be able to get their representatives. So they changed the law for political expediency. It wasn't a national law until much later. So the women in Upper New York created a platform for a universal suffrage amendment. Universal. So everybody who doesn't have the vote should now have the vote. And throughout the 1850s, it was abolitionists and women's suffragists working side by side as the slavery issue rose. And in fact, when the war broke out, Susan B. Anthony recognized that this was a moment for African Americans, and she stopped her work on women's suffrage in order to focus exclusively on the abolition of slavery during the war. It's a choice she would come to regret, because when the Reconstruction amendments were being considered for citizenship and votes, when they were being written, Frederick Douglass, who was a large voice in this whole movement, asked that the women not be included. He said it's going to put it too much at risk. Like America might be ready for blacks to vote, but they ain't ready for women to vote. That was his basic argument. They're not ready for women to be in this position. And he asked the women to wait. And Anthony had already kind of withdrawn her efforts from suffrage and grudgingly agreed. And they would have to wait another 60 years until 1920, or 55 years, and a whole new expression of American capitalism, creating all new spaces for women before they're going to find that they have political power. We'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But by the end of the 19th century, we can see that the South has secured white supremacy through its own legal structure, restructuring slavery and coercion. Freedmen have become sharecroppers, locked into debt peonage. The far West has been secured. No longer Native people are they a risk anywhere, and their numbers are going to continue to fall into the 20th century. And women have been structurally denied a place in the public and the political table. They are still considered domestic only, not fully capable of public life. We are building to a pinnacle of what we might call white male supremacy. The end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Those who had sort of fought for a place in this modern world were effectively marginalized, and men were still in control, and white men in particular. But the culture itself is beginning to kind of talk about itself in some interesting ways. There's a sense that we've got to get a handle on ourselves. There's a sense that we may have outgrown our britches a little bit. And so several punctuated depressions I told you about. The 1890s was, you can see it there, the worst of them all. I told you when depressions happen, it's like the world has ended. Well, it was clear the world had ended in 1893, once and for all. But then just 3 years later, things are on the rise again, and things were looking up. So as the nation embarks on the 21st century, really the 1896 election was its turning point, right? It's finally put to bed the shame, and it thought it was a shame, of that Reconstruction effort. And it was denying Black life altogether, right? You don't see it in any of our national images. It had done the same with its indigenous people, rounded them up, put them on reservations, defeated them. They were also forgotten in the urban industrial core. And women, they're not political subjects just yet. And instead, we're beginning to talk about national prosperity. And I think I said last time, the economy became politicized. It became something that politicians were supposed to work for. We became global in our reach after 1890. We're no longer settling the West. We're done settling the West. Jackson Turner told us that whole episode's over with. We're going to have to look elsewhere. We're an industrial power. We're not agrarians. We're not producers. We're not farmers. We're capitalists and industrialists. And we are self-consciously white. And whiteness is the term, but it's the dominant culture, and we'll see it get stronger until it finally breaks in the cauldron of World War II. But for the nation itself, we began looking outward. We began expanding our reach out to the globe, taking control of seaways, capturing refueling stations for our ocean-bound Navy, and making a world safe for white supremacy, which is about to reach its peak, right? This is when it's really feeling stronger than ever. And not only in the United States, but we're seeing it come out of Europe as well, and we're seeing it as a European expression around the globe, okay? Next time, I'm going to talk about the Republican Party and the way in which it navigated and helped all of these circumstances along at the end of the 19th century. There's about 3 minutes left in the class. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'll see you on Wednesday. Everybody signed in. There was a sign-in sheet. If you came in late, make sure you do sign in. See you Wednesday. Any questions online?
Have a good day.
Yeah, you too. Take care. We'll see you Wednesday.
Have a good day.
Yeah, you too.
Have a good day.
Yep. See ya. Thanks so much. Yep. Appreciate it.
Good day.
You too. Take care. We'll see you on Wednesday.